Well, lately I have found myself humming the song Eve of Destruction. Now, I wonder why I've been singing that one. And I don't know if you're familiar with it. The one I'm familiar with is a cover version by an Australian rock band called the Screaming Jets. And that came out when I was a teenager. But when the original version of Eve of Destruction was released in 1965, it was a little bit of a controversial song. It was a protest song rallying against the Vietnam War, rallying against America and its arms race. And the words were this: "Tell me over and over and over again how you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction. Don't you understand what I'm trying to say? And can't you feel the fears I'm feeling today? If the button is pushed, there's no running away. There'll be no one to save with the world in a grave. Take a look around you, boy. It's bound to scare you, boy. And you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, how you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction." Some of you might remember some eve of destruction moments in history. Of course, there's the Vietnam War. There's the ever-present fear of somebody pushing that red button and nuclear war erupting. And many in Ireland, you will remember all too well the widespread separation, division, grief during the Troubles. And maybe for some of you, September 11, 2001 is a reference point for you of eve of destruction type feeling. They were times of uncertainty, times of fear, times of lostness, and perhaps you're feeling a bit like that right now. It's certainly a strange time. So let me ask, how do you respond during troubled times like that, during eve of destruction moments? Do you close your eyes and perhaps pretend it's not happening? Distract yourself with binging on Netflix? Get on with life, keep calm and carry on? Or perhaps the opposite of that, do you get paralyzed with anxiety and fear? Do you find yourself constantly watching the news? You can't turn it off, and constantly criticizing every decision that the government or anyone else makes? Are you feeling hopeless, paralyzed, and helpless? Or maybe as we look at chapter 3 and 4 of Esther, we'll find that there's a third option. And you'll see the outline behind me, and I'll highlight the point we're on as we go to help you follow along. And we see that we start with an old hatred towards the Jews. Remember last week, we saw in the book of Esther that it took place during a time when God's people were exiles and they were living under this powerful, visible, look-at-me leadership of King Xerxes. And we saw in chapter 2, verse 10, that Esther, who became the replacement queen, hid her Jewishness because the Jews were a hated people. And in chapter 3, as we've just seen, this is made all the more clear. We meet Haman, the man that King Xerxes honors and lifts up and promotes to the position of Taoiseach, or prime minister, the ruler of the country, the second in command. But while Xerxes is honoring him, Mordecai wants none of it. He refused to honor Haman. Now, is Mordecai doing the righteous thing? Is he pious in his actions? Or is he being obstinate and stupid? Well, who knows? The writer doesn't tell us. But whether it's right or wrong, it's certainly very, very dangerous. Once Haman hears about it, his reaction is brutal. Have a look at verse 5 of chapter 3. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. That seems like a crazy overreaction. One man snubs him and disrespects him, and so he plots genocide. Why does Haman react the way he does? Oh, the Bible gives us a little clue. It's not a fluke. It's not a spur-of-the-moment decision. Here lies an old hatred. We're told that Haman is an Agagite. He's a direct descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And we're told earlier, in the last chapter, that Mordecai is a Benjamite. He's one of the Jews of the tribe of Benjamin, and he is a direct descendant of King Saul, the first king of Israel. And King Agag and King Saul hated each other. The Amalekites were an old enemy way back in Exodus of God's people, constantly trying to destroy them. And so Haman, in one sense, is merely following his family hatred of the Jews, his family hatred of God and God's people. And we touched on this last week. This hatred is not a relic of history. It's not limited to the Old Testament. It's not limited to Middle Eastern national rivalries. In John 15, Jesus told his followers, told us this: if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first, says Jesus. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own, but you don't. Now you may be thinking, my non-Christian neighbors and workmates, they don't hate me, I don't think. And I really hope they're not plotting to kill you. But Jesus is clear that this old murderous hatred is the norm for this world. In a world that hates God, in a world that doesn't want to submit to God's judgment and God's rule, then God's people, you, act as a reminder of this God they are trying to ignore. A world that hates God doesn't want Christianity to have a voice, doesn't want Christianity to influence the public sphere. In fact, they want Christians to be silenced, ignored, and relegated to a place on the history shelf. Well, this old hatred of God and his people, it serves as the background for the situation that the Jewish people find themselves in. Haman hates Mordecai. Haman hates his people, hates God, and he has seized an opportunity to destroy God's people completely. And so it's in this perilous eve of destruction moment that we turn back to look at Esther in chapter 4. And you'll see that here. Esther is a woman who is about to undergo huge change. She's going to undergo huge change. So firstly, let's look at the starting point for Esther. What was she like before this huge change? Well, chapter 4, verse 3 tells us, in every province in which the edict and order of the king came, this is the order to destroy the Jews, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Mourning, weeping, and wailing are very much an appropriate response to this eve of destruction moment that the Jews face. In fact, I wonder sometimes if we as Christians, we as the church, don't do enough lamenting. We're so quick sometimes to put on a happy face, to sing happy songs, and yes, to look forward to the great hope that lies before us. But sometimes we fail to lament. We fail to give voice to our fears and our sorrows, and we fail to cry out to God for comfort. Mourning, weeping, and wailing, they're the appropriate response here. And maybe they're the appropriate response right now during this coronavirus crisis we're in. But what was Esther in this story? What was she in great distress about? Did you notice that in verse 4? She wasn't in distress about the plight of her people being on the eve of destruction. She wasn't upset about that. No, instead we're told that she was sad that her cousin Mordecai was upset. Did you get that? She's sad because she sees that he's sad. Change out of that sackcloth. Cheer up, you're upsetting me, says Esther. And once Mordecai has explained why it is that he's upset, and once he's called on her, told her, you need to go to the king, you need to go to your husband and plead for mercy, beg for him to spare the Jews. Well, let's have a look at what her response is. Verse 11. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Esther knows that to approach the king is risky indeed. In fact, it could lead to her being executed. And she reasons that the king's not going to listen to her anyway. Let's be brutally honest here. He didn't marry her for her advice, for her counsel, for her wisdom. He married her for her body. And Esther tells us he hasn't even wanted that for a full month. Are you crazy, says Esther? I can't go to the king. Esther's starting point is not very impressive, is it? You might call her shallow, cowardly, self-absorbed. She's more worried about herself than the plight of her people. You might even say she's a little bit of a bimbo. But by the end of this chapter, a huge change has occurred. A huge change. Now she goes from being this self-absorbed bimbo to being a courageous woman who is willing to risk her life in order to save her people. Have a quick glimpse at where this ends. In verse 16, she says, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And here's the key line. She says, and if I perish, I perish. Now, what is it that causes this huge change? Well, that's what we're going to focus on right now. And I think there's 3 reasons that Esther becomes such a changed woman. And all 3 of these reasons come through what Mordecai preaches to her through the messenger Hathach. Firstly, and this is a surprising one, the first thing is that deliverance will not come. He tells her, do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape, in verse 13. And in verse 14, you and your father's family will perish. It's a grim message, isn't it? You are going to die. There's no hope that you will escape. All other hopes are taken away. Now, maybe you've been shopping recently and rather than they having lots of choices on the supermarket shelves, there's only one product left. And there's a freedom that comes from that. You don't have to look, oh, where can I go? What do I choose? Here's the only option. And that's what is happening for us. So there's no other option for salvation. You are going to die. In John 6, it's a sad but profound passage. And it's where many of Jesus's followers decide they no longer want to follow him. They turn around, they leave him because they find his words, his teaching too hard. And Jesus in John 6 turns to his disciples and he says, well, what about you? Are you going to leave as well? And the profound response from Peter is this, Lord, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. They, the disciples, throw their whole lot in with Jesus. They bet the house on him because they know that there's no hope anywhere else. He alone can save. And Esther is in that kind of situation too, a nothing to lose situation. She realizes that she is without a hope, that she can't rely on this world and its look at me powers, certainly not her proud and boastful husband. She can't rely on this world to save her. Deliverance won't come, says Mordecai. And this galvanizes her. Well, the second thing in Mordecai's message that changes her, well, it's the polar opposite of the first thing, and that is that he gives her a message of hope. In fact, it's the gospel. Deliverance will come. Verse 14, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Did you get that? If you don't do anything, don't think that God won't act. He's still going to act. God is a rescuer. And friends, that's the gospel right there. God is merciful. He's promised that he will save his people. Deliverance will come. And Mordecai believes this. He answers and urges the queen to believe it too. And now Esther too is changed by this vital message of hope. Last week I was watching a movie called The Book of Eli. It's set in a Mad Max kind of world, dystopian world, where everything has fallen apart. And there's no books left, or very, very few, apart from this main character, Eli, has a copy, the last copy of the Bible, and he's carrying it so that it can make it to a printing press and be spread. And somebody asks him, well, what's this book about? Why is it so important? What is it about? And the main character, Eli, says, to do more for others than you do for yourself. That's what I got out of it. Wrong answer. I mean, of course, that's a teaching of Jesus. That is in the Bible, but it is not the main message of the Bible. The main message of the Bible is not be better, do. The main message of the Bible, well, Mordecai gets it. The Bible is all about the good news of God's rescue, of the fact that God's deliverance will come. And that fact changes Esther. Which just brings us to the third and final thing that changes Esther, and it's that she realizes that God's silent sovereignty is being worked out through ordinary events and through ordinary people, perhaps even her. Have a look at the second half of verse 14. Mordecai says to her, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Mordecai tells her that this promised deliverance that was orchestrated and is dependent on God may be achieved through her. Perhaps that's the very reason she was born beautiful and grew up with a lovely figure. Perhaps that's the very reason Vashti was deposed. Perhaps that's the very reason that Esther became queen for such a moment as this. And that, friends, is a key message for us to hear right now. Esther may have been tempted to feel trapped, like everything was out of control, that her life, that her existence was just an accident or a mistake. Here she was on the eve of destruction. She was probably tempted to ignore it all and pretend everything is okay, which we got a glimpse of earlier on. Or she was tempted to be overcome by fear, paralyzed and helpless and hopeless, just like we are tempted to do those two things right now. Maybe right now there's things going on in your life, apart from coronavirus, other things where you're wondering, where is God in this? Why has he abandoned me? Why isn't he at work? And Esther's story tells us maybe he is at work. Maybe he's at work for mercy and deliverance. And maybe, just maybe, he will use you, even you, in his purposes in such a time as this. Esther asks us the question, how could God use you in his saving work right now? Friends, this is a unique time with unique opportunities. The world needs hope, and we have the words of eternal hope. So there's going to be unique opportunities to share it, to disciple those around us, and to spread this good news of hope. Well, Esther is a changed woman, isn't she? She sees she has no hope anywhere else. Deliverance won't come. She sees the truth of God's promise to his people. Deliverance will come. And she sees God's hidden hand at work. Deliverance might come through her. And so she is willing to put her faith in the right place, even offering up her life. Verse 16, she says, "Go to Mordecai, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Now, as much as the background of Haman's hatred and this eve of destruction change we see in Esther, as much as those things ask questions of us, how will you respond? As much as they call on us to respond in faith, the reality is that I'm not Esther, that you are not Esther, that we're unlikely to be the ones at the center of God's plan for salvation of the world. In fact, I know that we are not. We often make that mistake. We assume that we're the main character in the story. We identify with them. But Esther is pointing less to me and to you, although asking questions of us, yes, but not pointing to us. Instead, Esther points us to another rescuer who was to come. One who wouldn't just say, if I perish, I perish, but one who would willingly and obediently go to Jerusalem. Jesus knew what lay ahead of him. Esther has fear about going into the king's presence. Maybe I'll die. Jesus, he sweats blood as he goes towards the cross, and not with a maybe I'll die. He knows that he will go to that cross and die in our place, taking the sin of the world on his shoulders. Awful abandonment on that cross and paying the price for you and for me to be forgiven and to be redeemed. Esther, who says, maybe I'll perish, points us to Jesus, who willingly perished for us. And so the application question that we finish on today, the one I need to ask, the one you need to ask is this: where does your hope lie? Where does your hope lie? In lots of ways, it feels like we should be singing the eve of destruction right now. It feels like we're in one of those kind of moments. These are unsettling times. And so this is a key time to ask, well, what am I trusting in? Where are my hopes? What am I looking to for security right now? Are you trying to merely keep calm and carry on and pretend everything's okay? Flicking on Netflix and watching and watching and watching and pretending that nothing is happening out the window? Are you paralyzed by fear? Anxious, helpless, stuck, scared? Or are you being changed like Esther was, growing in your faith? Are you digging into the mercy of God even more? Not leaning on this world, on your career, on your job security, on your investments, on your good name, on your reputation, on your ability to save yourself. But instead, will you right now lean into Jesus even more? Trust even more in his love, in his provision, in his eternal protection. A mighty fortress is our God. He is a mighty fortress.